Reed's gaze lifted, peering through the swirling dirt that danced in the afternoon heat. Standing near his weathered fence post was a young Apache child, thin as a rail, with wild, tangled locks and mud-crusted bare soles. Her eyes held a desperate mixture of starvation and terror. She spoke no words, only pressed her small hands against her hollow stomach. Her mouth was parched, lips split from thirst. Without hesitation, Reed abandoned his work. He asked nothing of her identity, simply swung open his gate with a welcoming gesture. The child wavered, uncertain, till the aroma of freshly baked cornbread wafted from his dwelling, making her face brighten with sudden hope. Inside his modest kitchen, Reed set down warm cornbread and fresh goat's milk before her. She remained cautious as she settled into the chair, but when her fingertips finally met the food, she consumed it with the desperation of someone who hadn't tasted nourishment in ages. Elias fetched a worn woolen throw and spread it beside the hearth. Silence filled the space only. The gentle snapping of burning logs and the sounds of ravenous eating broke the quiet. Reed settled into his corner chair, pipe in hand, occasionally stealing glances at the young visitor. After satisfying her hunger, she pulled the blanket around her thin frame, offered Reed a brief, grateful nod, her wordless expression of thanks, then slipped quietly outside, vanishing into the crimson-tinged twilight. Reed remained motionless, staring into the dancing flames, overwhelmed by an unfamiliar sensation. Too many years had passed since a child's presence had graced these walls. 3 sunrises came and went after. Reed had fed the Apache child. He assumed their paths would never cross again. Yet on that 4th evening, as the sun blazed orange before disappearing beyond the distant peaks, Reed noticed a recognizable silhouette lingering by his boundary. T had come back. Her hair remained wild, her manners still wary, but this time she wasn't traveling alone. A towering woman stood at her side, gaunt features, bare shoulders bearing ancient lash marks, her left arm crudely bandaged with stained, tattered fabric. Her gait was unsteady, yet her dark gaze burned with fierce awareness. Reed set down his water pail and remained motionless on his porch. The woman halted roughly 30 feet distant, positioning her daughter protectively behind her, then spoke with a voice roughened by exhaustion. "We've got nowhere left to turn. I'm capable of any work, hauling water, preparing meals, tending animals, clearing ground. All I'm asking is shelter for one night, even beneath your porch." Reed studied them both in prolonged silence. His old hound let out a low rumble before quieting. Wind gusted across the field, sending red earth swirling and making the aged wooden barrier creak. He recalled the girl devouring cornbread days earlier, her cracked lips, that awkward little gesture of thanks. Now she stood behind her mother, clutching a piece of torn fabric. Her eyes still fearful, but flickering with newfound hope. Reed exhaled deeply. He wasn't a charitable soul, nor someone who welcomed others' burdens. But in that instant, his empty dwelling seemed to echo with a remembered voice. "Never abandon those who need help," words his departed wife used to speak. Back when she still walked this earth, he nodded slowly and pushed open his gate. Enter without further conversation. Reed walked toward his kitchen, rekindling the fire. When mother and child stepped inside, he retrieved an old wooden seat and placed his remaining cornbread loaf and a pot of beans on the table. Then he looked toward the room's corner where a thick blanket lay folded. "Rest there," Red stated simply. May lowered her head, her voice quivering. "Thank you, sir." Lahee immediately sat down, grasping the warm bean bowl, her strained expression gradually easing. Reed positioned himself across the room, watching the fire, asking nothing. He knew that sometimes silence becomes the greatest gift you can give. That initial evening, the small cabin grew so still you could detect every snap and crackle from the burning wood in the stove. Reed stretched out on his old wooden bed, back turned toward the mother and daughter curled together on their floor blanket. Solitude had become his companion. Yet tonight, hearing another person's breathing in his space awakened something within him. Not discomfort, just something foreign. When morning arrived and Reed ventured to the well, May had already risen. She hobbled forward with another bucket, shoulders shaking from pain. But her expression was set with resolve. "Allow me," she insisted firmly, as though needing to demonstrate her value. Reed remained silent. He simply lifted the bucket from her hands and placed it beside the well in the livestock shelter. As Reed worked to repair the hay feeder, he spotted T following him inside. The little girl set a handful of hay before a young calf, her eyes sparkling with joy. Reed paused momentarily, observed her, then gave a quiet acknowledgement. He didn't smile, but the hardness in his stare softened slightly. By midday, when Elias came back from the fields, he discovered the porch had been swept spotless, and his damaged shirts mended with coarse thread. Awanatata sat resting against a post, her left arm still aching, but her eyes held more lifelike someone who discovered meaning after fleeing too long. Reed stopped on the steps, taken aback. Years had passed since anyone had touched his belongings, and now someone was quietly caring for them. That evening's meal passed peacefully. Awanada had flavored the bean pot with herbs she kept in a small cloth bag. Reed took a taste, gentle warmth spreading through his mouth. He spoke nothing, simply continued eating. But something subtle shifted in his demeanor. A softer quality appeared in his gaze. T sat near her mother and released a gentle laugh, the first time. Reed had heard her express joy. It was quiet, innocent, and he realized too much time had elapsed since such a sound had filled this space. The following day, while Reed mended fencing, he observed Awanatata moving carefully with a makeshift crutch, collecting dried grass. Her injury still troubled her, but she didn't cease working. She labored consistently, never abandoning tasks half-finished. Reed approached, took the bundle from her shoulder, and loaded it onto the cart. They met each other's eyes. No words were shared, just quiet comprehension. 3 sunrises had come and gone. The cabin, once accustomed to silence, now contained sounds of movement, water being drawn, and utensils tapping against cookware. It wasn't a family, not quite, but something approaching it, and no longer a dwelling meant for solitude. Reed maintained his distance, yet he sensed change beginning, gradually without words. The morning sky stretched clear, and golden light swept across the grassland like a shimmering blanket. Reed Callahan took his hammer toward the northern boundary where ancient wooden posts had finally given way. Solitude had been his working companion, but today 2 figures trailed behind him. Anata, her shoulder bound with rough cloth to protect her wound, pushed up her sleeves and hoisted a heavy beam as though pain meant nothing. Her shoulder muscles tightened. Her weathered hands gripped the timber securely. She positioned it precisely where needed. Reed's brow furrowed slightly, not with disapproval, but amazement. He hadn't anticipated a woman possessing such power and determination. T refused to remain idle either. The small girl gathered bundles of straw, helping collect dried grass for the livestock shelter. A group of inquisitive chickens trailed her steps, making her burst into laughter. The sound rang across the open space, something Reed hadn't experienced since losing his family. When noon arrived, all 3 rested beneath the ancient oak's shade. Reed offered the water container to Awanada. She drank, and something in her expression grew gentler. T, positioned between them, opened a cloth pouch and distributed what remained of roasted corn. Extending some toward Reed, he accepted it slowly and nodded instead of speaking thanks. That afternoon, they collaborated to fix the horse shelter's roof. Awanada climbed up, pounding wooden boards into place, perspiration soaking her shirt back. Reed steadied the ladder below, occasionally looking up, but his expression no longer held uncertainty. It had transformed into something resembling quiet admiration. T, barefoot and dusty, stood close by, passing them nails and tools, small but eager to contribute however possible. By dusk, dinner felt transformed. Rather than silence, Awanada posed brief questions to Reed about the property and crops. He responded gruffly, though his manner had lost its coldness. T chimed in, chattering about the newborn calf, bringing laughter to both adults. That evening, Reed sat on his front porch, lighting his pipe and surveying the yard, now neater after their shared labor. Inside the cabin, Awanada was folding her daughter's blanket, her movements sure but tender. Reed drew deeply from his pipe and exhaled slowly. Within him, something had started to glow, a warmth he'd believed had departed forever. It wasn't exactly family, but this dwelling no longer felt hollow. I genuinely value your presence here. And if this tale awakened a memory, perhaps of dusty evenings, and the echo of hooves stirring in your soul, then please subscribe to my channel so we can gather together each day. And I'll share another tale from the frontier. That evening, wind screamed through the door gaps, swirling ashes in lazy circles around the flames. Reed sat at his table, carving a small wood piece into a fishing lure with his pocket blade. Awanada positioned herself across from him, mending a damaged shirt with thick thread, while T slept peacefully. Wrapped in a blanket near the stove, the room held warmth but heavy quiet. After considerable time, Awanada set down her needle and raised her gaze. Her eyes dark and profound. "You likely wish to understand," she spoke softly, her voice low and rough. "How the girl and I came to be here?" Reed offered no reply. He simply nodded briefly, set aside his wood carving, and waited. Awanada drew a long breath. "We lived in Baker's Ridge previously. I belonged to a man there. He treated me as possessions. When I failed to bear him a son, he struck me, called me useless. The whip scars, the damaged arm. ... She raised her bandaged limb, her hand shaking slightly. "They came from him." Her voice wavered, but her gaze stayed proud. "I couldn't endure it further. I took Tiva and fled. We wore our feet raw, crossing rocky hills, stomachs empty, legs bleeding, just to escape his reach." Quiet settled over the cabin. Only crackling firewood and wind sweeping the porch remained. Reed slowly rose, walked to the fireplace, and added another log. He said nothing, but as flames grew, Awanada clearly saw his eyes cold. Gray, steady as iron, not pity filled them, not curiosity. Just comprehension and something resembling respect. Awanada lowered her head and continued, her voice even gentler. "If he arrives here, I'll depart. I won't bring danger to your doorstep." Reed observed her for a long moment, then slammed his knife onto the wooden table. His voice was low and determined. "Nobody has the right to drag you back to that nightmare. Not while you and the girl stand on this ground." Awanada froze momentarily. Something unreadable crossed her weathered features' confusion. Perhaps then her expression softened into quiet thankfulness. She said nothing more, just bent her head and resumed sewing. Reed returned to the table and picked up his wood piece. He continued carving. But deep within, he understood that from this moment forward, their destinies were connected, even if nobody spoke it aloud. That afternoon, the sky burned crimson like flames. The sun approached, setting, but its blazing radiance still scorched the grassland. Reed Callahan was securing his horse's reins when the old dog suddenly snarled, fur standing upright. Hoofbeats echoed in the distance. Dry and thunderous like a burial drum's rhythm, Reed looked up, squinting at the dusty red path leading to his ranch. A single rider approached, tall and lean, hat pulled low over half his face. But in his shoulders' angle and riding style, Reed immediately knew this was no harmless wanderer. Awanada stepped onto the porch, one hand gripping the doorframe firmly. She recognized that outline even from 100 yards away. Her breathing accelerated. Her wounded arm trembled slightly. "It's him," she whispered. Reed didn't question. He placed his hand on the Winchester grip, leaning against the water trough, his eyes turning cold as iron. The man stopped his horse outside the gate and raised his head. A long scar gleamed across his cheek down to his chin in the sunset's glow. He released a dry, mocking laugh, his voice rough and cruel. "Awanada, you actually believe you can escape me? You're mine, woman. And that girl, too. Both of you are my property." Inside the cabin, Tiva let out a soft cry and clung to her mother's dress. Awanada stepped forward, but Reed raised his hand to halt her. He moved onto the porch, tall and steady as a fence post. She doesn't belong to anybody, Reed declared. Right. His voice low and firm. The man laughed contemptuously, but anger flashed in his eyes. He drew his gun and aimed it directly at the porch. The air grew tight, stretched taut like a bowstring. Reed didn't flinch. Calmly, almost too calmly, he raised the Winchester and cocked it with a sharp, echoing click that broke the silence. The sound made the man's horse rear and whinny in terror, striking the ground. "Lower the weapon," Reed said, eyes fixed on his target. "If you want to ride away breathing." The man's jaw tightened, his finger twitching on the trigger. Awanada, behind Reed, held her breath. Tiva hid behind the door, eyes wide with terror. For a moment, both men stood like mountains, ready to collide. Then finally, the man released a furious growl and lowered his weapon. "You'll pay for this. Cobb, the entire damn town will learn you're sheltering a savage woman." He turned his horse sharply and rode away, disappearing into the swirling red dust of the dying Sunday. Reed lowered the Winchester, his expression unchanged. He stepped back inside where Awanatata still trembled. Holding T close, with just one look, he communicated everything necessary. From now on, he wouldn't let them flee anymore. 3 days later, a southern wind swept red earth across the grassland, thick as smoke. Reed Callahan stood on his front porch, eyes focused on the dirt road. He knew that man would return, and this time wouldn't be alone. Hoofbeats thundered across the land, heavy and threatening like war drums demanding revenge. From the winding trail, 4 riders emerged from the haze. Leading them was the Baker's Ridge man, his face twisted with hatred, pistol at his side. He reined in his horse at the fence, sneering as he shouted, "Cobb, I warned you." But you wouldn't listen. "Hand over the woman and girl, and I'll let you keep your property." "But if you refuse," he snarled, drawing his gun and aiming it straight, "we'll burn this cabin to ashes." Awanatata pulled Tiva inside, fear in her gaze. Reed stepped down from the porch, Winchester secure in his grasp, his voice rough and steady. "This is my property. Nobody's taking them anywhere." The air went motionless. One of the men hurled a torch into the dry fence. Flames burst instantly, black smoke spiraling skyward. Laughter echoed through the heat. "Fire!" the leader roared. Gunshots cracked through the air. Bullets smashed into wooden posts, splinters flying everywhere. Reed brought his rifle to his shoulder and fired. One man tumbled from his horse, hitting the dust hard. Awanada, from behind the door, grabbed the hunting rifle Reed had prepared and fired a shot that destroyed one of their wagon wheels. Sending their horses into panic, T screamed, but Reed yelled, "Get down!" and dove aside, firing a second shot. The bullet grazed the leader's shoulder, making him howl in agony as he fired wildly back toward the cabin. Smoke, flames, and red earth merged into a deadly tempest. Reed dashed to the water trough, crouched behind a timber beam, and fired again. Another man clutched his stomach and fell. Finally, as fire still blazed and smoke hadn't cleared, the leader snarled, "Retreat. Next time I bring the whole damn town." He turned his horse and rode off, the last 2 men scrambling after him into the blood-red haze. Hoofbeats faded into the distance, leaving only crackling fire and thick gunpowder smell. Reed exhaled, blood trickling down his shoulder, but his eyes remained cold as steel. He turned back to the cabin and saw Awanada standing in the doorway, her rifle still smoking, T clutching her dress. In that moment, all 3 understood this was no longer temporary shelter. They had defended their ground together, and from now on, anyone who dared cross that fence would face consequences. Winter had ended, and the harsh, dry winds slowly surrendered to strange, gentle warmth. Across the fields surrounding the ranch, tiny grass blades pushed through cracked earth. Birds returned, singing on the porch roof, still marked with bullet scars. Reed Callahan leaned on his hoe, wiping sweat from his forehead. The arm once grazed by a bullet had nearly healed, leaving behind a scar thin as silver thread. Beside him, Awanatata rolled up her sleeves, her strong arms flexing as she lifted a heavy wooden plank, though her old wound wasn't completely healed. Her eyes burned bright, the look of someone who'd made her choice and wouldn't retreat. On the porch, Tiva sat, building a stone circle, giggling with delight. Every time wind blew her messy hair across her face, she turned and called out, "Mr. Reed. Mama says we're planting more corn today." Reed smiled a smile he hadn't allowed in ages. "Yes. We're going to have one magnificent harvest, day by day." The three of them reconstructed the burned fence, dug planting holes, and repaired the cabin roof scarred by gunfire. None viewed this place as temporary anymore. With every hammer strike, every row of turned soil, an unspoken promise took root. This is home. When darkness fell, the stove fire flickered, casting shadows across wooden walls. Reed sat in his chair while Tiva slept with her head resting in Awanada's lap. The Apache woman glanced toward Red, her deep eyes no longer guarded, but quiet and warm. "You know," she whispered, "back in the tribe, I never thought I'd have a home like this." "It's wonderful." Reed nodded, the gray in his eyes marked with weariness, but also lit with something he hadn't felt in years. Hope outside. A crescent moon floated in the dark sky, shining down on the little cabin nestled in the vast grassland. But inside that wooden house, loneliness no longer dwelled. A rancher who'd lost everything, a mother abandoned by the world, and a child who once seemed destined to grow up afraid they had found each other. They hadn't chosen the easy path, and they were far from accepted by Red Bluff Town. But they had chosen each other, and that was enough to transform even this harsh land into a place called home. And as summer's first breeze arrived, carrying fresh grass scent, Reed knew this wasn't just land. This was where his heart would remain. Dear friends, love on the frontier doesn't need promises or witnesses. It grows from weathered hands willing to lift each other up, from glances that understand pain words cannot reach. In a land this unforgiving, love is the only strength that prevents us from being lost. Because when we dare to give our hearts, every wound can heal and every house can rise again. And in the end, I wish for each of you a life full of happiness and health. I love you all, the cherished audience of Wild West storytelling. Let me know how this story made you feel. Leave a comment down below.